Welcome, my wonderful spirits, to SOS 25, Sessions of Spirit. For those that are new, this is going to seem very unusual at this point in the sessions because we're quite far along. But I'm going to do a quick recap for you in about 2 minutes to give you some ground on how we got here. So why are we talking about canceling sin, how to cancel original sin to reach spirit? Well, it's because the first session was about this guy named Hegel. We think he's the greatest philosopher because he brought together 3,000 years of philosophers into one system. And then session 2 was about for 200 years. It was very hard to understand that for people. Number 3 was that when you do understand it, you can change the world practically. Number 4 was that you get beyond the stereotypes of Hegel, and you grasp his first negation, which leads you to number 5, beginning at his true beginning and arriving at this concept of the circle of reason, where number 6, it feels religious, but you sublate religion with philosophy. Number 7, you do that with universal logic, which will get us the Nobel Peace Prize. Number 8 is you begin this logic with polemics, which is just the first negation. But the truth of that is sublation, session 9, which is genuine refutation is the polemic of polemics. Number 10 is that there's a masterclass in this called The Science of Logic that Hegel wrote. The 11th session is that it's truly profound and underestimated, the science of logic. It's literally the ineffable speaking itself. Session 12 is that this is the purpose of life. 13 is that the purpose of life is to grasp this living logic to liberate everybody. 14 is that it feels religious, like you're connected to God. But number 15, it's like you're connected to your inner child and you feel free to be yourself atheistically as well in a profound way. 16 is that all our gurus were just doing this as the science of logic implicit. 17th is that we're sublating the old mysticism to grasp the real power of now scientifically. 18 is about the limit of our reasoning this way is the limit of our fun, games, and flow. 19th is that when you become a really great philosopher, you refute people through laughter. That's what sublation is. 20 is that the ideal philosopher does this over and over and over again, and we use the synchronicity document in session 21 to do that, to overcome ignorance, which is evil in religious language. 22 is that we have lots of particular technologies that look like they could be evil, so we need a high level of wisdom. So we need to teach this universal logic, which is 23. We covered this universal logic in a more in-depth way, how to apply it practically and concretely in a plant-like way. And then 24 was about how when you go to change the world, you're gonna have to communicate this one by one with people, and that there's a right way to do it, which is paradise and sublation, and there's a wrong way, which is kind of hellish and painful and abstract. So session 25 is called How to Cancel Original Sin to Reach Spirit. The SOS has a double meaning, standing for Sessions of Spirit, obviously, but also save our souls, because real philosophy, Hegel says, is not just theoretical, it's practical. And that's why we're talking about how to speak with other people in a much more harmonious way to change the world. So to give you a summary of what this session is going to be about, there's a one sentence or a one summary paragraph. And it goes like this. The only way to begin genuine philosophy, a truly scientific system, in terms of religious language, is to make God a certainty and not an assumption. To atheists, this may sound like anathema, but to those who are not yet ready to enter into the world of pure thought and philosophy in the scientific mode, the symbols of the faith still contain logic, and this truth is immanent like it is in philosophy. A genuine philosopher has a compassion and an understanding to bring out the goodness in the logic immanent to a system worthy of that name. They do so because they do not lose the essence of wisdom in the symbols. Hegel found an ingenious way to begin philosophy godlessly, that there is no assumption of God, gods, or godism in the true beginning. Ironically, paradoxically, and profoundly, the only way to get in touch with the first true philosophical and infinitely scientific thought is to get rid of our sin by getting rid of our finite conceptions of God. Because the entirety of ordinary human thinking is finite, it is sinful. And this means any thought of God or gods in this mode necessarily means it is tainted and contingently limited. By negating all notions of finite God, we arrive at the first divine thought as actual science. Later, these thoughts think themselves not into an assumption of the absolute, but as a logical certainty through the dialectic of its own movement. The knowledge of this is the transformation of ordinary picture thinking into spirit and spiritual reason. I hope you enjoyed that. You might not have heard anything like that before, because this is a novel interpretation of this profound philosopher named Hegel, who lived about 200 years ago. But let's unpack it a little bit and see if there's some content worth integrating. So last time, the last session, session number 24, we spoke about the biggest practical sublation that we will need to do in order to actually change the world and bring in this new world spirit that Hegel says happens when you grasp philosophy in its true essence and its true meaning. And we're talking about building up from the foundation and fulfilling things rather than just negating them. We're building on things in a more harmonious, integrative way. And we're going to have to start by taking what's in these sessions and actually having communications or conversations with people, usually one-on-one. Because in the beginning, it's a little uncertain. You don't talk to big crowds and inspire spirit in big crowds until you become incredibly good in flowing with the universals. So what is this big sublation that we have to do if we stand any reasonable chance at sublating the world, rather than ending up in maybe a more historical communist situation where we saw that the contingency of history sort of turned into the opposite of its ideal? Had some beautiful ideals, it just didn't manifest. So we want to avoid that kind of thing. That's a dialectical reversal, and it happens because our reasoning isn't deep enough. It doesn't grasp that the living spirit that keeps you from that twisting in the negative moment of reason and allows you to stay in the ideal as the spirit of sublation. It's a continuous, more continuous process. Well, what is that thing? It is religion. It is spirituality itself in our current epoch, contemporary religious consciousness. And the reason why I'm saying this is because it is well known that most of the world is in a religious mode of consciousness, or if they've gotten out of religious dogma, they still identify as spiritual. That's 84% according to studies 10 years ago, but I think it's only grown since, or it's remained relatively the same. So if you want to change the world and you don't want to engage meaningfully with religious consciousness, you aren't going to change the world, at least not for like 50 to 100 more years. And that's just the truth of how history and spirit evolves, is that it has to go through stages. You can't skip a stage, Hegel says. You have to go through the negations. History moves through one logic and one logic only. It's the method that has no method. It's just literally the cancellation of presupposition as negation, moving through itself without your cognitive bias. And so when pure thought is moving through history, through us, through our minds, through the laws of the universe, it's just doing that one negation over again. It's like a perfect continuity. It's almost like the Planck length, except not sensuous. It's like the smallest logical step that you can make between concepts that are actually distinct. And in speculative thought, we also see them as the same. There's always this sameness, and there's like a harmony, a unifying, and a breaking apart. And it's constantly doing that. And we're going to be experiencing the same kind of logic as we try and sublate the negatives in our current epoch, in our current time in history, especially after the pandemic has exposed them. Okay. So didn't we already cover this kind of sublation? Didn't we sublate this back in Sessions of Spirit number 6, where we talked about, canceling sin for the first time, and we talked about, the relationship of philosophy to religion and religion to philosophy? But yeah, we did, but we didn't talk about the particulars. So we're getting into the particulars. This 84% isn't just, it is like a general consciousness thing, religious consciousness, but these surveys are showing the particular breakdowns of the individual religions that are constituting that. So we have some definitions, some determinacy that we need to work with. And then that session was just about the general relationship between the two, that at the end of the circle of reason is sort of this all-knowing omnipotence that sounds like religion. And it is what religion was trying to approximate, but you don't have to be separate from it. There is a sublation that happens, and that's what philosophy is. It's a fulfillment not necessarily a negation of religion. There's something in religion that we have to preserve. That's what a sublation is compared to a negation. A negation is just a complete canceling, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. A sublation is an integration where you're preserving something, but you are also canceling. You're not being naive. There is something in religious consciousness we do need to cancel. And even people in religion are feeling it now, as there's a contradiction emerging between modern science, as we saw with CRISPR, and traditional religious universals. So that's what we did. We did this sort of macro relationship between them. Philosophy is the sublation of general religion. But what about the particulars? How do we engage in a conversation about actual things in the here and now? You know, religions actually existing now. There might have been religions in the past, but they might have fizzled out. They might have went into a different direction and you know, changed into something that's not what we'd consider religion. But today we need to engage with what we have in our time, and we need to do it in a particular way while sort of also doing the universal and keeping that in mind. So it's true, you know, most of the world is in religious consciousness, is not in philosophical consciousness. They're mostly in religious consciousness. But here's the holy grail. We don't just want people, as we talked about before, in philosophical consciousness. We want genuine philosophical consciousness, the kind that Hegel talks about, where you're sort of rebuilding this God, not as an indeterminate beyond of absolute revelation and authority that you must obey, where we see a bunch of sexual exploitation in the churches and a whole bunch of sacred places are being vandalized by human particularities. And there's a lack of wisdom there that's allowing that to happen. And it doesn't make the divine text wrong. It just means the way that we're going about it as finite creatures, our interpretation is the sinful part in terms of Christian religion. So genuine philosophy is what we're aiming for. And that's what Hegel realized, but we don't even have that to work with. Like we have some steps to take here. So it's not gonna be easy. That's why I'm showing you this particular example, to really protect anybody that wants to go down this path of world spirit. Like if you feel like the pandemic puts you into a dark night of the soul, and you're watching some of the weather reports and you're seeing that there's, you know, delivery people passing out on the street because the heat is so intense for their area, you're not used to it. Or you're seeing extreme weather events because you think climate change is happening, and the data is starting to show that it is, or just international geopolitics, the Ukraine-Russian war. There's a lot of things happening where you can't go about this process naively when you don't have genuine philosophical consciousness. Nobody has understood Hegel for 200 years, so it's pretty safe to say that we have some close philosophers now finally, but there's always been some kind of one-sidedness in the past that's prevented us from having a genuinely sublative spirit. So these particular abstractions, these fragmentations in our dialogue, our global dialogue, they've persisted for 200 years, even though Hegel gave us the principle, the universals in the science of logic to start sublating. So, okay, where should we start with this then? Yes, we got to start with religions. Which religion do we start with? Well, just between Christianity and Islam, I think there's around 2.5 billion people. So that seems like a pretty good starting point. You cannot change the world when well, we have 8 billion, so a third, roughly a third, is in these two modes of religious consciousness. And there have been plenty of Christian philosophers and theologians who have studied Hegel, and still we have not attained this true speculative freedom. We still have all these contradictions. Why aren't the Christians sublating everybody if Hegel says it's the top religion? They can't even do it with Islam. And Islam's like sparked up to sort of be in opposition that was supposed to be a sublation because they still accept Jesus, right? But they say there's something about Jesus we need to cancel. And that thing is that he's just not God. Sorry, he's a prophet. He's a man, just like Muhammad. We have the humility to at least admit it, that Muhammad's a man who just has a lot of universals in him, and we listen to him. And he did a better job, or maybe not a better job, but he built upon what Jesus had said. So he's the fulfillment of Christianity. Hegel doesn't think so. And this is why the tension is sort of persisted, because there is a sort of truth to both sides that we need to grapple with, but we sort of need to start from the beginning of the logic in this particular mode to unravel in a determinate way how that's going to happen. Because we can just say, oh, why don't you just love each other? Love thy enemy is a Christian thing. So, why don't you just do that? But we don't really have that. We don't really have that wise love. We have a form of what Hegel calls an indeterminate love, a love that's kind of in the feeling. It's your common sense. It's like you can't think it. It's just part of your being, right? But when you can't think it, you can't make it a part of your will in an explicit way. And so there's a whole room, there's like a ton of room where you can put in human contingencies, human imagination into that space, right? And Hegel says the only way to solve that is to make the divine thoughts explicit so you can talk about when they're happening, when they're not happening. Because if you have to submit to an external authority, then you're not allowed to question it. That's when the people who prey on you, like the people who are not in the spirit, who aren't true Christians, let's say, or they're out of control of their particularities and they're struggling with some kind of, disorder, pedophilia is being termed a health crisis now, and not just a crime. And that's probably the real inroads of love, to say, what are these people grappling with? And then you self-recognize with them to find their truth so you can actually stop it from going underground and sublate it, because you're treating them like a spirit that just has a problem. And when you feel alone, what do? You isolate, you abstract, and then you do it anyway because you're out of control. So this loving spirit, I think, really is the true healthcare system, and it's the true protection of the vulnerable. So we have to make this authority that's far away, we have to make it logical so that we can know it, but we don't put our sort of finite spin on it, this sinful knowledge that we're trying to cancel, right? The only way to reach spirit is apparently to cancel knowledge. But as we covered in the Garden of Eden in the previous sessions, session number 6 in particular, in terms of the Christian symbology, there's many different symbologies for this in all the religions. We're just going to stick a little bit with Christianity just to make this session more manageable, and also because Hegel sort of finished with it. We saw that the knowledge, yes, starts off as sinful, but then it makes a transition to blessed knowledge. So knowledge itself is not the wrong thing. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the Christian perspective that reason is below faith and all that kind of stuff. There's a misinterpretation there where they're not making the dialectical flip. What we mean by sinful is just finite. When your knowledge is finite, it's incomplete. It's like fragmented. And whenever there's a fragment, it creates an opposition that you can't identify with, and it becomes your enemy, right? And that's where all the negative moments of reason causes all this pain and trauma and war and dehumanization in the worst cases. So let's start at the beginning then. Where do we start, if not directly with Christianity? Well, I want to cover something important before you even try to have these sublative conversations with people of intense religious faith, because their lives are on the line. Like when you commit, not just epistemologically to a faith, when you commit your heart, spirit, and soul, you're doing that on an ontological level in a strange way where the dialectic is moving your being and your being's moving your thinking. So these people feel like they're dying if you negate their faith, right? So you have to be very careful. So what you're going to be accused of, if you try and sublate all the religions into one system like Hegel did, what you're going to be accused of is false prophecy, that the biblical scriptures, but so does Satan. You're just twisting it. And the dialectic is all about that, right? If you're not aware of how it works, you can't sublate. You're stuck in a negative moment of reason. So Hegel gives an example in his Encyclopedia Logic, where he's going through these famous philosophers of his time. One of them is this guy named, the particulars are hard for me because I'm an autodidact a lot, even though I studied in university. The names are foggy, so it's either Jacobi or it's probably not Jacobi, because that's like the ordinary conscious. It's like Jacobin, Jacobi, I don't know. But there was a guy, a philosopher right before Hegel, who was quite famous, and he said, you know what, there's this type of faith, philosophical, we're breaking out of the sort of religious and we're grasping thought, but he said, there's this philosophical faith where you can bring it all into harmony. And he says here in the quote, so I'm giving you a direct quote because this is really unusual stuff in terms of traditional Hegelian scholarship. Some people, of course, have hit on this, but it's not, I would say, accepted. So we have this sentence here where he's talking about Jacobi, And Jacobi, just give me some room here, guys. It's a lot, right? But he says this kind of faith, philosophical faith, it has room for the faith of the Christian. It equally admits a belief in the divinity of the Dalai Lama, the ox, or the monkey. Thus, so far as it goes, narrowing deity down to its simplest terms, a supreme being. What he's saying there is, yes, this philosophical consciousness has a sort of breadth to it and a harmony that feels like sublation, because what you sublate becomes ideal, right? Those two words are linked. What you sublate becomes a moment. It loses that fixity that you can't break out of. Your inner child can kind of move freely and sublate into new dialectics, and it can move. That's what reason is. That's why he says it has to be living, right? But he's saying here that even though this kind of philosophy looks this way, there's a problem with it. It remains in the faith mode, immediate knowledge, and not this developed knowledge, which is what spirit is about. So Jacobi is trying to break out of this limitation of religious consciousness, but he's kind of staying in it by accident because he's not grasping the dialectical notion of faith. That faith is just immediacy that might include all these other modes, but they're not really in their determinate form. They're not really different from each other. They're just different names for the same indeterminacy. And indeterminacy, as you know, is sort of like this thing that has no definition in it. It's just like the beyond, the thing you can never know. The scholastics made the same mistake, according to Hegel. But he says, of course, real God, real truth, real logic is immanent. It's absolutely present. And when you get in touch with it with your mind, you gain presence, the power of now. And you really can embrace all of these determinate modes in yourself. So he gives a name to this kind of the shared indeterminacy that Jacobi is not getting away from. And he called it a supreme being. All these things, the ox, the monkey, the Dalai Lama, these things are to him a supreme being. It's just not, the differences aren't really explicit. So we don't want to make the same thing because you'll be nailed with this sort of pantheism, this sort of like these modes of, you know, sophist language that religious consciousness really doesn't like. And so here's Hegel calling him out on it, that you can't really do this faith version of this philosophical sublating. It has to be explicit. That's what spirit is, because you need the logic to show the symbols and how they are used differently in each versions of these gods, the ox, the monkey, Dalai Lama. You need to say why they're different, but why they're the same in a determinate way. That's what we're going to do. That's the wise way. This is what spirit is. And if you look at this last sentence of this quote, Hegel says directly, don't confuse this with the spiritual fullness of Christian faith, whether we look at that faith in the heart of the believer and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit or in the system of theological doctrine. So whether you're a Christian or not, what he's saying here, and the important word here is fullness. Now remember, in the last session, we talked about a nicer way to speak about the order of the religions and the ideologies in the circle of reason. People want to say, oh, the earlier ones are baloney. We see their limitations. Atheists love to say this. You know, we used to think that the earth was the center of the universe, you know, because God loved us. And then we found out, uh-oh, we're not. So, you know, you want to bash the states before you, but don't do that if you're having these conversations. You can also look at it the opposite in a speculative way, right? There are people on earth that think ancient wisdom is the true wisdom. We've deviated from that. So we need to return back to that pureness. And that's kind of the proper way. Actually, to be honest, Hegel does both. But most people get into these abstract negations because if you go into the ancient past, you negate the present. But if you stay in the present, you negate the past. See, they're just doing the same logical moment. It's the second moment of logic. That's all they're doing. You don't want to fall into that trap. It's a necessary moment. Don't be naive and think you can skip it like Stalin did and other historical agents that tried their best. And they didn't do it naively. To our Stalin deserves some love. I know people don't believe that. There's a sublation that has to happen there. We are not negating the acts that happened. Those were, but we have to think about the negative moment in a more loving way in sublation to get from this negation to these ideas of foundation and fulfillment. So these earlier categories, the ancients, the people who like ancient wisdom are right. The ones that came before are pure in a certain way. but they do have a limit. So that's why sublation is about preserving the truth, that ancient wisdom that the sort of empaths sort of like, the people who are in tune in a mystical way, or the mystical tradition. But you have to cancel something. Remember, sublation has 3 moments logically, and it's positive interpretation. You have to preserve the truth, you have to cancel the limit, and then you have to raise it to a higher understanding. That's what the progression on the circle of reason is. So he's saying here that Christianity does come later. It's one of the final stages, and there's a fullness to it, even though he later on sublates religious consciousness in general. Christian faith is the summit of religious consciousness, not because it's completely negating all the previous religions. It's because spirit is about understanding the determinate logic in all the previous modes. That's what we're going to do. That's you showing the truth of the foundation. And that's why the Christian faith, when it's held properly, is supposed to be this fullness. It's supposed to have all that stuff in it. And there's a lot of kind of instructions in a certain way to achieve that kind of fullness. But the reason why these religions haven't achieved spirit yet explicitly, they have a sort of abstract spirit, Hegel would say, is because the universals aren't explicit to them out of their faith. Remember, the logical order of soul and spirit is that soul comes first as the implicit totality of the science of logic and absoluteness. And then spirit is just the explication through consciousness of those universals to itself. And then you can work with them with your spirit. You can align your spirit with the ultimate spirit and all that religious language, right? That's why he's mentioning Holy Spirit here. He's saying that there's an indwelling Holy Spirit, which is this kind of soul stuff going back to the science of logic before nature is created. As you know, the whole science of logic self-sublating or negating itself in its own absolute freedom into what it's not, so that it can have an externality to know itself. So there's this kind of totality inside of you that's implicit. But then he's saying that the system of theological doctrine is the closest thing you get in religious consciousness to philosophy. They're trying to systematize it. There's some hallmarks of real science in there, but it's always sensuous. And so he's trying to make the contrast here between the indeterminate kind of Holy Spirit, where you know it's inside of you in your soul and you can feel it. And there's a fullness there that when you're connected to it properly, it comes through you in a coursing emotional way, rapture maybe, flow state. But there's a way to make it explicit. And he's trying to say that's what theology was trying to do, to get to spirit, right? But they couldn't get to the concrete spirit because sensuousness is finite. And it limits you from grasping that infinite thinking that is the science of logic. It's like that constant sublation where you're never stuck in the fixity or in that sinful thinking, that limited non-philosophical thinking. So don't make the mistake of that philosophical faith. You want to have the order clear. That's what's going to kind of protect you when you're talking about this kind of everybody needs love, everybody. That's kind of the hippie stuff that works only for people that are empaths and grasp that fullness in themselves. But for the people that don't, they're just going to think you're naive. And that's where philosophers come in with this explicit wisdom to say what the hippie is feeling, because they do have truth. They're ahead of the game. They're so far ahead, they don't even know how to explain it. And sometimes there's a limit there where they fall into their own sensuousness. But so where do we start with the actual ordering, the determinate way of thinking about this unity of all these religions? How do we have this mega sublation in a practical, particular way? Well, Hegel gives us the answer. And he gives us sort of the answer in the history of philosophy, but he also kind of gives it in the philosophy of religion. And he says they all follow the same order because it's the divine order, it's the necessary order, it's the scientific order. It can't really be any other way because there is one science of all sciences. And of course, there's people that will negate that. We're going to talk about that more in the next session. But for now, we're talking about engaging with people in the religious consciousness in a one-on-one kind of conversational style, where even myself, I will be on these live streams doing it one by one, and people will be watching, and we'll be doing this dialectical dance. But we're following the same order in every mode. So where do we start? We start where the science of logic kind of starts. We start where contingent human history kind of starts. And it starts with these ancient religions, Egyptian or Vedas, the Egyptian gods, Buddhism, and then we get more modern. So the synchronicity document of philosophies, that spreadsheet. If you're new, you don't know about this, but there's a document I linked to at the end of this where we start with each column having a philosophy in it. And the old ones are at the very beginning, the ancients, and then we move chronologically. The logic and this determinate order of how you have to sublate these religions is in the same way. So that's a huge heuristic. You don't have to destroy your mind with rote memorization, trying to think of like 60,000 different logics, which is what we have today. It's actually just one logic. You just need to learn how to recognize it in all these particular forms. That's what religions are, that you're trying to get to the essence that's behind them. So here's the order right here for you. We start with Hinduism, according to Hegel. And the reason why we start with Hinduism is because it is pure being. Their main god, even though they're considered a polytheistic religion, the first one is Brahman or Brahma. I think I got a quote here for you. It's the same god as the Eleatic one. And as we know from the previous sessions, the Eleatics were the first ones to grasp pure thought, like one of the first pure thoughts, which is pure being, as pure being, no sensuousness to it. It's just their sensuous, but they grasped the pure being, but it was an indeterminate being. It's that kind of being that you can't know. And so Hinduism was doing the same thing with Brahma. And in a way, he says it is kind of not just a polytheistic religion. It is, but he says they do have a higher level concept that looks like monotheism. But he says it's not the true spiritual theism. They remain kind of separate. So there's this indeterminacy that remains where they're not connected as the determinants of that indeterminacy, if that makes sense. The polytheistic gods are what make Brahman concrete if it was realized that the pure thoughts that they represented, right, the universal. So that wasn't really made. Heidegger was trying to say, well, how does the general being turn into all these different beings? I think it's through this kind of process that religion was trying to go through, where they realized there was many infinite beings, a pantheon of gods, but they didn't really connect them in the inner unity. They fell prey to the finite thinking, the sensuous thinking, the fragmented thinking that prevented the unity of the science of logic from forming in their religions. But we start with Hinduism because it's the first pure thought, the first category of the science of logic, which is pure being. Then it evolves into Buddhism. So Buddhism was the contingent naming in human history of the next like evolution of the science of logic, of the spirit developing its own universal logic. It was kind of this extension on what the Hindus were doing sort of when they meditate, right? Their priests, or not their priests, well, their gurus, you know, they would sit there and go, repeat a mantra, and they would break out of sensuousness and enter the realm of pure thought, or enter some kind of godly realm. But that realm they're entering is the supersensuous realm. It's the realm of pure thought that Hegel's talking about, where the science of logic happens, and your consciousness is just a unification with that. So Buddhism comes in, of course, with Buddha, and he tried to universalize this state even more. But this category of going inward is, Hegel says, not the ultimate. You're still you're breaking free of that soul mode of indeterminacy, right? Where spirit emerges out of this kind of faith, right? But it hasn't really got there yet. It's just starting. So this move that is being made is what Hegel calls being for self. And so we move past Hinduism. We move past this kind of monotheism. That's not real monotheism, not determinate monotheism. And we get into this, this idea of being within self. Being within self happens about 5 stages into the science of logic. So we're about 5 leaps roughly, or 4, 5, 6 leaps past pure being where Hinduism was. And this stage results in what Hegel calls the pure something. That's why I put this quote here for you. It's straight from the science of logic. It's where he's describing this somethingness as the negation of negation. So we get the first real sublation. And if we're going to be sublating these religions, you've got to kind of grasp this. But in terms of religions, Buddhism was the one that sort of brought pure being up into this. But there's still an indeterminacy, because when you're in yourself, you're not thinking explicitly with the thoughts. You're sort of just negating everything that's around you and dwelling within that blissful feeling within yourself in a sort of meditative state. And this is not necessarily what Buddha was doing. The divine masters usually have the concrete totality, but when they're communicating, it kind of gets put in this finite form. And so this being within self logically is just the pure something. And this pure something takes a universal, a generality, which is determinate being. So there's a category that comes after pure being. So you got pure being, it evolves through its pure logic into pure becoming, and then into something called determinate being. It's the first stable thought. Pure being is not really stable. You know it's there, but it's not stable. This one is the one where you have your first like yin yang, where you have pure being and pure nothing staying contrasted with each other, so you can hold it in your mind. This is in the supersensuous realm. It further evolves into its own quality, and then it turns into reality. And then this reality, negation in general, speculatively thinking, it's the same thing, negates itself, but it goes inwards to the pure something. But the pure something is the particularization. It's like an instance of that general determinate being. So Hegel tells you what this means in terms of religious language. This doesn't sound like anything profound unless you're a logician and you're understanding what I'm saying in logical terms. But Hegel gives you a hint at what this really means in its true profoundness. He says this is basically the move from the Godhead to God, to increasing levels of determinate God. Okay, so Godhead is like this generalness, and then God is like the determinations of that, a particularization of that, where it's actually something that's more than just a generality. So that's why this move is so profound. And Hegel says the Buddhists were doing this. So now you have, I hope I've really linked in your minds a concrete example of the real profoundness of these individual categories. Hundreds of years of human history were spent grasping each of these categories, and Hegel just gives it to you in like a couple hundred pages. Absolutely 100% incredible. It's like the ineffable is speaking itself. But here we're talking about particular religious modes, right? So we're breaking out of indeterminacy. That's a big word for us now, right? It's kind of it's a good word in a certain way, but most of the time it's not, because it creates this authority that's always beyond that. You can't know immanently, so you can't know spirit. We're getting past that for the first time with being within self, but it's only a first category. It's only a beginning. And so if you look in the comments here, guys, I'm not opening them, but there's a lot of content here for our scholars who might be wondering, what the heck? Hegel doesn't say it aligns with history and all this kind of stuff. Well, you really have to do a deep dive. It took me 3,000 hours, right? So look at the comments, read them for yourselves. I give you some explanations to help you understand how to bridge this. But let's get into Christianity and Islam directly now. These are supposed to come after these first two moves that are more indeterminate, even though the gurus were completely present, right? This is not necessarily a critique on the state of the divine ones. They might have had the truth, but the explication of it's the problem. Getting it out of that indeterminacy is the problem. So this is what philosophy is supposed to be really good at least genuine philosophy and sublation. So armed with this kind of logic, and when you understand the other categories, it gets more intense. When you realize that this is all that's happening, you can kind of go into the symbology of whatever religious consciousness you're engaging with conversationally, whether that person is a Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a person of Judaism. It doesn't really matter. They're all particular expressions. And so let's do Christianity now. Let's say, okay, well, what's the logic of Christianity? Well, what the Christians are right about. So remember, sublation is about canceling preservation. So you got to say what was right about Christianity. But what was the limit? Hegel did sublate all of religious consciousness. He did sublate Christianity, even though he claimed to be a Christian. That's what he was in the religious consciousness. But as a philosopher, you're canceling something and raising it to a higher standard. And that standard is pure thought, no sensuousness, right? But what the Christians got right, what we have to preserve, is that this speculative statement that Jesus makes, the principle of their philosophy, of their religion, is that he is 100% man, 100% human, 100% God. All human, all God. That's a contradiction, makes no sense. Atheists love to throw that around and say that makes no sense. But that's actually the true nature, the circular nature of real thought. And you can use it in a sophist way, or you can use it in this genuinely philosophical clarity in this determinate way, which is what we're doing. So how do you make sense of this? Well, when you achieve spirit, that's you reunifying with the divine idea, the absolute idea, the perfect science, right? That's what modern science is approximating in its fragmented way. When you really grasp this as a human, you're 100% truly a human being, a finite being, a sinful creature, they call you. But when you grasp this universal logic, the science of logic deeply, it doesn't just stay in you epistemologically, it changes you. It is the very essence of everything. It's it's an ontological move too. So this is something that Jesus grasped at very high levels. And when you grasp those high levels, it in colloquial, sort of in modern psychology, it's like you experience this phenomenal state that's kind of like a psychotic break. That's a negative term, but it's only negative because people who have a psychotic break without understanding the science of logic or this divine universality, they're groundless because they use sensuousness, finitude, the resistance of finitude to hold them stable, right? From their infiniteness of their soul, of their subconscious mind. So when you don't have that, and you don't have the order of the categories, and you don't know how to put the religions in their order, in their foundational order, in their fulfillment, you are all over the place. Infinity just hits you. And that's what creates the bad version of psychosis. And you do a bunch of like irrational things. But if you do grasp the order and you break from that finitude, then you're grasping spirit. You're sublating subjectivity and objectivity itself. You are really moving in a different kind of world, but you're still in the world, right? It's what Christians would say, you're in the world, but not of the world. It doesn't fix you. You're not stuck in the fixity of the finitude. You have this genuine freedom of philosophy that Hegel's talking about, but you can have it in religious symbology. Just what defines you as a philosopher is that you're not stuck in it. You can move in and out of it and treat it as beautiful to its limit. That's what they're right about. And it sounds crazy, but I put a little quote here for you straight from the Bible saying that Jesus himself, Christians, said you can do this. You will do greater acts than he did if you believe or if you grasp the science of logic, the universals, in the way that he was living. And the early Christian movements were much more about the way than about the institutionalization and the sensuousness. Yes, the death and the resurrection was a pretty incredible thing, but it was the way that all happened that was important, the super sensuous. So what's the limit here? We're running out of time a little bit, guys. Thanks for letting me stay over. How do you talk to a Christian in this way? Well, the limit here is the sensuousness itself. So you can see here I put sensuous Jesus and super sensuous way. So the sensuous Jesus is the man himself. People fixate on that and they sort of ignore the logic, right? So he was a man. He was maybe white, maybe not. He had longish kind of hair. He moved in, he liked walking and all this kind of stuff that's very particular. And that looks like it might have actually happened in human history. So maybe the contingencies are correct, right? So don't argue those things. You can argue for 10,000 years until the historical records actually show the science of it through anthropology. But you want to focus on the universals, the logic here, because the coherence is what you make sense of these contradictions in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, or in any religion, including Buddhism. With koans are the same thing, right? They're just doing these speculative oppositions, and they're saying it does make sense, but it doesn't make sense over and over and over again. So when you see that in any sort of guru, that's what they're doing, right? Like what we talked about with Eckhart Tolle. You have to grasp this in a determinate way to get the spirit. So you have to kind of get the conversation onto the super sensuous Jesus. What was the real message beyond the parable, beyond the particularities? You're going to get to the logic. And if you read the Bible with the science of logic in your mind, with being within self and all these types of things within you, you can identify very quickly and recognize very quickly what the real order of the Bible should be. Like if it wasn't chopped up in human testimony, like that's the arbitrary part. It's like John came, they just kind of came together. And yes, that has a providence to it. They came together in a certain order, but the actual logic is still fragmented. So that's what we're fixing with modern science in a way. We're retracing the steps, but we're doing it in this imminent way that we can know. This authority beyond is what we're turning into spirit, that we can know it scientifically. So of course, this dialectic is the fundamental principal difference between Muslims and Christians. Muslims believe that this speculative statement is not true, that the logic is not circular, that you are just a prophet, you're just man, and you might be channeling some divine insights. Well, by the way we're talking about it, they're right in that the sensuousness is, or they're right that the sensuousness is the limit, but the super sensuousness, the logic really is what you achieve, and you achieve it in this profound way. So I guess to kind of sum it up kind of quickly is that you are a prophet, but prophets are actually gods. They are actually on earth. They are these genuine philosophers that Hegel is talking about, where you're moving through the world with this real wisdom as part of your being. It's literally moving through you. And so we have to say, instead of negating, so what Christians usually do, and what Muslims usually do to Christians, is they just negate each other. But the true sublation of this conversation is to say, yes, the thing we're preserving is that the speculative logic that Jesus was talking about was the truth of the logic. It really is that way scientifically. But it doesn't mean that Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was not also divine, was not also God. He was just more humble about it, you could say. Or maybe he didn't reach the same speculative heights where they started blurring, truly sublating subjectivity with objectivity. But that means you're not negating, you're actually lifting up Islam with Christianity, with Buddhism, with all of them. You're just saying what the categories are in each of them logically. They are foundational. So that's how you identify the limit, and you bring the ideal out of them. You bring the ideal of the Christian side. Yes, they just want to believe that Jesus was God, right? So, okay, you give that to them in the speculative way, but it means that they have to get rid of that indeterminacy. That means they have to also embrace spirit in the scientific way, where the atheist can finally, put their guard down, because they are allowed to know. They don't have to submit to an external indeterminacy, and then they don't have to have all this randomness happen to them. They can question it, because science allows you to do that, because you're making things indeterminate that are indeterminate determinate. And then you say everything else is like that. And Prophet Muhammad was right with a lot of things that he was saying. He needs to accept how great he really was. And then you raise them up. So it's not a lessening. Sublation is about bringing up together. And when you bring it up together, that's how you get out of religious consciousness in general. You sublate religious consciousness entirely, and a genuine philosopher loves them all within their limits, right? They're all beautiful as long as you know the logical categories that they represent, because that tells you how to be reasonable and flow between all of them as they raise each other as foundation and fulfillment over and over and over again. I hope that makes a lot of sense to you. I put the two little triads here from yesterday's or day before yesterday's session, where the 16 paths are Parmenides. This is person 1 in the first triad, and this is person 2, and the red is where they actually are. So when you talk in the way I'm talking, you're bringing out the ideality and everything without being ignorant about the limits. So you're just being kind and wise, not naive. So that means you have to hold this position of sublation between both people if you want to get to these kinds of super rational conversations where you can talk about these limits that have divided people for thousands of years. This is just the beginning. I put a lot of quotes in here to help you guys reason along with how I discovered this by actually reading Hegel. So for the scholars in there who are thinking this is nuts, please go and read that. I don't have time to cover it in this session. But a really quick recap, if you really want to try and have these conversations. So the first step is absolute negation. So in 5 minutes, I hope to cover this at the top of this hour. Remember in session 6 of Spirit, Sessions of Spirit, we talked about the absolute negation was needed to start canceling sin. You're doing the Descartesian move of saying my knowledge is sinful and it's finite, right? The atheists say it's finite. Okay, good. We have cognitive bias. You cancel that and you arrive at I think, therefore I am. That's Descartes' foundation of true knowledge. But that's, to Hegel, only the epistemological absolute negation. You're just canceling your finite knowledge. You're not canceling the thing that's creating the finite knowledge, right? Which is your actual sense organs in your actual physicality. He says the true absolute negation, the second one, is the ontological one as well. This is where you cancel the finitude of your actual being itself. And this sounds impossible to do. How do you cancel yourself and keep thinking? Well, this is where you're allowing the spirit within you to keep thinking itself as negation. So it's just the pure logic thinking itself that's already in you, in your soul, you could say. So this divineness that's in you is what's carrying forward after you cancel yourself. So you're canceling not just sin, you're canceling original thing, the very principle that creates finite knowledge in the first place from the Garden of Eden in terms of the particular symbology of this religion, right? So when you do that, though, you're changing the being. When you change the being and not just the thinking, that's what ontology is. You're changing the actual thing that's there in its definition. So that's what you're doing to yourself. You're doing this true absolute negation in the Hegelian version, and in a particular religious symbology of Christianity. This is what they're trying to approximate with their sensuous language, right? So because we're coming from the sublation, we're able to see what this really means logically. And it leads you to the first pure thought, the true foundation. And guess what? The worst religion is there. Hinduism. The worst one, the least developed, the least Christian. Well, actually, it starts there in religious consciousness. This happens again in philosophy, but that's the Eleatics, right? So they're the foundation of the philosophy as philosophy. But we start with, we vindicate Hinduism, then we move to being within self, which is Buddhism. There's another religion for being for self, but I didn't have time to quote it, so I just left it pretty simple for you guys. Then it evolves into the notion. The notion is basically these categories in more concrete forms. It's all the same kind of logic of differentiation and return. Then you get sort of the notion, taking its externality and sublating that. And then you get what Hegel calls the highest level of logic, which is the absolute idea, which religious consciousness calls God. God thinking itself perfectly outside of nature in the supersensuous realm. But then something happens, and we get this sort of break of the absolute idea, the divine idea, othering itself in its absolute will, its absolute freedom. It's all powerful, it can do whatever it wants. So in order to know itself outside of itself, it creates something that it's not. And that's where the genuine concept of free will, that's God's gift to people, to humans, that they actually have real free will apart from its free will, even though it's all knowing. That contradiction is sublated in that way. But you sort of get the repeating of God's logic, you could say, or the science of logic in sensuous form. So you just get a repeating. And I only showed you the two later categories of the notion. The notion reemerges with sensuousness, and this is what we call consciousness. It's abstract spirit, which has an object that it interprets in a sinful kind of way. This is where sin kind of comes in as explicit to ourselves. Animals can't really be sinful because they're not conscious enough to be sinful. They're just following the animality of the negation of nature. So the notion is the first time we rise above this, it's just logic coming through. But then even that logic rises up and it starts to complete itself. This is what Christianity is starting to do. But it's just a formal spirit. It's just the beginning. Muslims also grasp this, but because they're not grasping it concretely, that's why they're opposing each other. The sensuousness is dividing them apart. They're not grasping the logic that unites them. So this is what Jesus and all the gurus, Buddha, Muhammad, all of them, this is what they were really teaching, was this final one, absolute spirit. You grasp the science of logic concretely, and it unifies you because it's all a masterclass in sublation. And you put them all in their right order, and that's why you can love them and talk with each one of them to their limit and show them that every stage beyond them, you can put into their symbols. You don't have to say Buddhism comes after Hindus, you have to become Buddhist now. No, you can actually go into Hinduism and use their gods to rebuild Buddhism, rebuild Christianity. You can use their sensuous symbols because they can't break out of that. That's why they're in sensuous consciousness. If you try and impose another religion on them, you're going to be in for a rough ride, a really rough ride. That's what we've seen in history. That's the slaughter bench of history. We don't want that to be our world spirit. Okay, in the last minute here, I hope that makes a lot of sense to you. If you want to practice and try this, master the science of logic a little bit more. It's your cheat sheet that Hegel gives you. But the practical spirit here, we give you some tools to engage now. So if you want to try and do this, start conversations on the Hegelians who want to change the world. You'll have a little bit of an audience. We're going to start doing the Socratic, sort of the Plato dialogues, and start to have this kind of subjective dialectic embodying this more objective ontological dialectic. You can take the wisdom quiz to check to see where you actually are. We can try and help you determine that, how sublative you are. So you're not jumping like head first into deep waters. There's the synchronicity document that if you do grasp it, you can start putting your favorite philosophers and sublating them, or your favorite religions, start sublating them in the columns. If you're really concerned about technology, start doing that with the professionals that you know are in those domains. If you want to sublate with me directly, or if you want to start spreading the universal survey of wisdom so we can get a good picture of who to sublate on these live feeds, please do. But if you want to come and sublate with me, just come to the live feeds, and that's all I'm doing. People come and negate me, I'm just sublating. You can do the same thing. Once you learn it, you can just start your own live feed, and we can start spreading the spirit of sublation and putting these particular religions in their divine order, in the essence of the gods that they truly want to believe in and feel a part of in their souls. So tomorrow, we're going to talk about the inverse of this. So if you're sick to your stomach as an atheist, we're going to do that to existentialism and atheism. Well, more existentialism tomorrow. Atheism comes a little bit after. So thank you for listening, guys. I hope that was helpful to you. Even if you don't jump on board, I hope this starts to change your life, and that Hegel starts sublating the fixities in your life into this genuine reason, so that you can take philosophy and its genuine mode into your relationships and into your life. Thank you, and I'll see you in the discussion.
Can you please post the notes in the chat so everybody can have access to them?
I can. Where is the stop recording button? Oh no, guys, was I not showing my screen the whole time? Oh my goodness. The particularities are starting to get to me. Am I not even recording? Oh, I
No,
am.
you're still recording.
How do
All
I
you have to
do-
do is punch the record button and that should stop it.